You were never really part of this family, my daughter-in-law Vanessa said in probate court while adjusting the pearl bracelet my husband had given her for Christmas just 2 years earlier. My son Daniel sat beside her in silence, staring down at the polished oak table like a man studying a stranger's reflection. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I simply folded my gloves neatly into my lap and smiled. That smile must have unsettled someone because the attorney sitting beside me suddenly shifted in his chair and cleared his throat. The courtroom itself was colder than I expected. The kind of cold that settles into your bones no matter how expensive the building looks. Outside the tall windows, rain streaked down the gray Chicago skyline while strangers hurried along the sidewalks with umbrellas tucked beneath their arms. Inside, my entire 43-year marriage was being reduced to paperwork. Mrs. Harper, the probate judge said carefully, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed the file in front of him, your late husband's estate appears to have undergone several revisions shortly before his passing. Vanessa leaned back slightly, confident enough to almost smile. She looked beautiful that morning in a cream-colored designer suit, polished and composed like someone attending a charity luncheon instead of dismantling her husband's family. Daniel finally spoke, though he still wouldn't look at me. Mom, nobody wants this to be difficult, he muttered quietly. Nobody wants this to be difficult. The words settled over me heavier than the rain outside because they sounded exactly like his father used to sound whenever he tried to avoid conflict. Richard always hated tension. He would rather absorb discomfort than confront someone he loved. But Richard Harper had never allowed anyone to humiliate me. Not once in all our years together. My fingers tightened around my gloves as memories drifted through my mind with painful clarity. Richard standing in our kitchen at 6 every morning making coffee before work. Richard insisting on carrying every grocery bag even after his heart condition worsened. Richard whispering to me during sleepless nights that no matter what happened, I would always be protected. Protected. Strange word to remember while sitting in probate court listening to my daughter-in-law explain why I supposedly didn't deserve my own husband's money. Vanessa crossed one elegant leg over the other and finally looked directly at me. With all due respect, she said smoothly, Richard built this company for Daniel's future. Evelyn contributed very little financially over the years. There it was. Not grief. Not concern. Not family. Just money. Numbers. Ownership. Value. I noticed the court reporter glance up briefly before returning to her keyboard. Even she seemed uncomfortable. I could feel Daniel shrinking beside his wife, trapped somewhere between shame and cowardice. And suddenly I understood something painful with complete clarity. My son wasn't protecting Vanessa because he agreed with her. He was protecting the life she controlled. The house. The image. The comfort. The illusion that he had become successful enough to escape the modest life Richard and I built together from nothing. Vanessa continued speaking, her voice calm and polished. My husband and I simply believe the estate should be distributed fairly. Fairly. Another interesting word. Because 3 nights earlier, while sitting alone in the library Richard loved more than any room in our house, I had discovered something hidden behind a row of old accounting books. Something my husband never told Vanessa about. Something he probably never even told Daniel. And as the judge reached for the next folder on his desk, I realized they still believed I was the weakest person in that courtroom. That was their first mistake. The rain had stopped by the time I returned home from probate court, but the air still carried that damp November chill that settles over Chicago after sunset. I parked slowly in the driveway of the colonial house Richard and I bought 38 years ago when Daniel was still in elementary school and money was tight enough that we used lawn chairs in the living room for almost a year. The porch light flickered softly against the darkening sky, and for a moment I simply sat there with my hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at the warm glow coming through the front windows. From the outside, nothing had changed. The flower beds were still trimmed neatly. The brass mailbox Richard polished every spring still reflected the streetlights. The curtains in the dining room still hung exactly the way I had arranged them 15 years earlier after our anniversary trip to Vermont. But grief changes a house. It removes sound first. No television humming softly from the den. No footsteps overhead. No coffee brewing before dawn. The silence becomes so complete that even the refrigerator motor sounds startling. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside carefully, setting my purse beside the entry table where Richard used to toss his car keys every evening after work. His jacket still hung in the hall closet because I had not found the strength to move it yet. Sometimes I opened the closet just to catch the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the fabric. I knew that probably sounded foolish for a 71-year-old woman, but after 43 years of marriage, certain habits become stitched into your soul. I moved slowly through the kitchen, switching on the small lamp near the sink instead of the harsh overhead light. The marble countertops were spotless. The tea kettle sat exactly where I left it that morning. On the refrigerator door hung an old photograph of Daniel at age 12 holding a baseball trophy almost bigger than his chest. Richard had been standing beside him with one hand resting proudly on his shoulder. Back then my son still looked at me with warmth in his eyes. Back then family still meant something simple and safe. I filled the kettle with water and noticed my hands trembling slightly for the first time all day. Not from fear. Not even from sadness. It was exhaustion. The kind that settles deep inside your chest after spending hours pretending not to be wounded by people you once loved more than yourself. Vanessa had not always been cruel. That was the part people never understood about women like her. Cruelty rarely arrives wearing sharp edges. Comes smiling, helpful, charming. I still remembered the first Thanksgiving she spent with our family after she and Daniel got engaged. She brought homemade cranberry bread wrapped in decorative ribbon and insisted on helping me wash dishes afterward. She called me Miss Evelyn back then and asked endless questions about Richard and the early years of our marriage. Sometimes I wonder if manipulation always begins as admiration before it slowly turns into resentment. The kettle whistled softly, pulling me back to the present. I poured hot water into Richard's favorite navy blue mug before catching myself halfway through the motion. For 3 months I had still prepared tea for two without thinking. Grief creates strange reflexes. I carried my tea into the library and paused near the bookshelves lining the far wall. Earlier that week, while searching for an old insurance file, I had noticed one accounting book sitting slightly forward compared to the others. Richard was meticulous about organization. Nothing in this room was ever misplaced accidentally. Slowly, I stepped toward the shelf again. My heartbeat steady but deliberate now. Somewhere beneath the silence of this house, beneath the loneliness and humiliation and legal paperwork, my husband had left me something important. And deep down, I already knew Vanessa would do almost anything to make sure I never found it. The accounting book felt heavier than it should have when I pulled it carefully from the shelf. Richard had always preferred hardcover ledgers over modern filing systems because he believed physical records could not disappear with the click of a button. Paper leaves fingerprints, he used to say whenever Daniel tried convincing him to digitize company records. At the time, I thought it was simply one of those stubborn habits men his age never outgrow. Now, standing alone in the quiet library with rainwater still tapping softly against the windows, I realized my husband may have been trying to tell me something long before he died. Behind the ledger sat a slim black folder tucked flat against the wall of the shelf. No label. No markings. Just Richard's initials pressed faintly into the leather corner. My pulse slowed instead of quickened as I picked it up. Strange how calm a person becomes when they finally stop hoping everything was a misunderstanding. I carried the folder to Richard's desk and sat down in the same worn leather chair where he spent thousands of evenings balancing budgets, reviewing contracts, and pretending not to notice when I brought him late-night coffee just so I could spend another few quiet minutes beside him. The desk lamp cast a warm amber circle across the papers as I opened the folder carefully. The first page was dated 8 months earlier. Irrevocable Trust Amendment. I stared at the words for several seconds before continuing. Richard's signature appeared at the bottom alongside the signature of our longtime attorney, Harold Bennett. Harold had handled every legal matter for our family since Daniel was in high school. If his name was attached to this, the document was legitimate. My eyes moved lower across the page, and suddenly the room became very still around me. The primary residence, investment accounts, and 70% ownership of Harper Industrial Supply had been transferred into a protected trust under my name weeks before Richard's final hospitalization. Not Daniel's. Not shared jointly. Mine. I leaned back slowly, trying to absorb what I was reading. Vanessa had spent the last month speaking about the estate as though everything already belonged to her husband. Yet according to these documents, much of it had already been legally shielded from probate entirely. Richard knew. Somehow my husband had seen this coming. A cold ache settled into my chest then, not because of the money, but because I suddenly understood how worried Richard must have been during his final months. I remembered small moments differently now. The quiet tension whenever Vanessa discussed future renovations to the house. The way Richard once changed the subject abruptly when Daniel joked about eventually selling the company building downtown. The long evenings Richard spent alone in this library after family dinners while everyone else laughed in the kitchen. He had not been working late. He had been preparing. I turned another page and found a handwritten note clipped carefully beneath the trust documents. Evelyn, if you are reading this, it means things unfolded exactly the way I feared they might. I closed my eyes briefly at the sight of his handwriting. Even after 3 months, grief still arrived unexpectedly, sharp enough to steal breath from my lungs. Richard's letters always slanted slightly upward when he was emotional. I knew every curve of his penmanship better than I knew my own reflection. The note continued in calm, deliberate sentences. Vanessa is smarter than Daniel realizes. She values security above loyalty, and our son mistakes control for stability. Do not blame him too harshly. He wants peace more than truth. But protect yourself, Evelyn. Promise me that. I pressed my fingertips against the paper gently. Outside, headlights swept briefly across the dark library walls as a car passed the house. Somewhere upstairs, the old heating vents hummed softly through empty rooms. And for the first time since probate court that morning, I finally understood why Vanessa had looked so confident. She believed she already knew every document Richard left behind. She had no idea my husband spent 43 years quietly learning how to protect the people he loved. The next morning arrived gray and windless, the kind of cold Midwestern morning where the trees outside seem frozen in place against a sky the color of old newspaper. I barely slept. Richard's note remained folded neatly on the desk beside me while dawn slowly crept through the library windows. At some point during the night I realized something painful but undeniable. My husband had not been protecting himself from strangers. He had been protecting me from our own family. That understanding settled into my chest heavier than grief itself. By 8 o'clock I was standing in the kitchen making coffee when my phone vibrated across the counter. Vanessa's name appeared on the screen. For a moment I considered letting it ring, but after 40 years of marriage to a businessman, I understood timing mattered almost as much as truth. People reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they are still in control. "Good morning, Evelyn," Vanessa said warmly the second I answered. Her voice sounded softer than it had in court, polished, carefully into concern. "I just wanted to check on you after yesterday. I know these legal meetings can feel overwhelming." I poured coffee slowly into my mug before responding. "That is thoughtful of you." There was a brief silence on the line, as though she expected more emotion from me. Vanessa always preferred people predictable. Tears would have made her comfortable. Calmness unsettled her. "Daniel feels terrible about how tense everything became," she continued smoothly. "Honestly, we are all just trying to make practical decisions right now." Practical. There was that word again. People like Vanessa use practical the same way other people use kind. It made selfishness sound responsible. "Of course," I replied quietly. Richard always appreciated practical thinking. Another pause followed. I could almost hear her recalculating. "Actually," she said carefully, "Daniel and I were hoping to stop by tonight. There are some financial documents we still need to organize before the next hearing." I glanced toward the library doorway where Richard's hidden folder still rested untouched inside the desk drawer. "What kind of documents?" I asked. "Oh, mostly account summaries and company records," Vanessa answered quickly. Too quickly. "Some things appear to be missing from the probate disclosures." Missing. Interesting choice of words. Because according to Richard's trust papers, the only people missing information were Vanessa and Daniel themselves. "Tonight should be fine," I said calmly. "I will make dinner." Her relief came through the phone immediately. "Wonderful. Daniel has been worried about you feeling isolated in that big house alone." Isolated. Another carefully selected word. Not lonely. Not grieving. Isolated. As though I were slowly becoming incapable of managing my own life. We ended the call politely, but the moment I placed the phone down, I stood perfectly still in the quiet kitchen staring at the steam rising from my coffee. Richard had been right about one thing. Vanessa valued control more than affection. And now she was nervous enough to start searching for documents personally. By late afternoon the house smelled faintly of rosemary chicken and fresh bread, though I had little appetite myself. Habit carried me through the motions of cooking more than hunger ever could. At 6:15 sharp, Daniel's silver SUV pulled into the driveway. Through the front window I watched my son step out first, shoulders tense beneath his charcoal coat, while Vanessa adjusted her scarf in the passenger mirror before smiling toward the house. She always prepared herself before entering a room, almost like an actress stepping onto a stage. The doorbell rang softly. When I opened the door, Daniel leaned down awkwardly to kiss my cheek. He smelled faintly of expensive cologne and winter air. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly. He looked exhausted. Older somehow. Vanessa stepped inside behind him carrying a bakery box wrapped with red ribbon. "I brought dessert," she announced brightly. "I thought we could have a peaceful evening together." Peaceful. Another interesting word. Because hidden upstairs in Richard's library sat the very thing capable of destroying the future Vanessa believed already belonged to her. Dinner unfolded beneath the soft yellow light of the chandelier Richard installed himself 20 years earlier after insisting the dining room needed a little elegance. The same mahogany table where birthdays had been celebrated and Christmas dinners stretched late into snowy evenings now felt strangely formal, almost unfamiliar, with Vanessa seated at one end carefully unfolding her linen napkin while Daniel stared silently at the steam rising from his coffee cup. I served rosemary chicken, roasted potatoes, and green beans with almonds, the exact meal Richard always requested after difficult weeks at work. Habit again. Grief turns life into a collection of habits you continue performing long after their purpose disappears. "This smells wonderful," Vanessa said brightly as she cut into her dinner. Her voice carried the effortless confidence of someone who believed she already understood the outcome of every conversation in the room. "You always know how to make a house feel warm, Evelyn." I smiled politely and passed Daniel the breadbasket. "Thank you." Daniel finally looked up briefly. His eyes appeared tired, shadowed beneath sleepless nights and quiet tension. For a moment I saw traces of the little boy who used to sit at this same table struggling to finish his vegetables while Richard pretended not to notice him feeding peas to the dog under the table. That child seemed impossibly far away now. Vanessa reached for her wineglass gracefully. "I was actually speaking with the realtor this morning," she said casually. "There is a lot of interest in homes around this neighborhood right now." Daniel shifted slightly in his chair but said nothing. I placed my fork down carefully. "A realtor?" "Just informational conversations," Vanessa replied smoothly. "Nothing immediate, of course. But large houses can become difficult for one person to maintain, especially after 70. Especially after 70. The words floated softly across the table wrapped in concern polite enough to sound harmless to strangers. But I noticed Daniel avoiding my eyes again. He knew exactly what his wife was doing. "Your father loved this house," I said quietly. "He designed most of the renovations himself." "Of course," Vanessa answered quickly. "But at some point practicality has to matter too. Emotional attachment can make financial decisions harder than they need to be." There it was again. Practicality. Financial decisions. As though 43 years of marriage could somehow be reduced to square footage and market value. Daniel cleared his throat softly. "Mom, Vanessa and I have just been thinking long term." Long term. I studied my son carefully then. His expensive watch glinted beneath the chandelier light while his wedding ring tapped nervously against the stem of his glass. He looked uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to disagree with her. That realization hurt more than I expected. "What exactly have you both been thinking?" I asked calmly. Vanessa answered before Daniel could speak. "The company requires stability right now. Investors notice uncertainty after a founder passes away. Daniel needs flexibility to lead effectively." Founder. Led effectively. Investors. She spoke about Richard's life the way executives discuss quarterly reports. "And where do I fit into all this?" I asked. Softly. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. Vanessa finally offered a careful smile. "You deserve peace, Evelyn. Less stress. A simpler lifestyle. Maybe a luxury condo downtown with security and amenities. Somewhere easier for this stage of life. This stage of life. I folded my napkin slowly into my lap and looked around the dining room. The framed family photographs. The crystal cabinet Richard built by hand one winter while recovering from knee surgery. The grandfather clock ticking steadily near the staircase. They were discussing my future as though I were already halfway absent from it. Then Daniel finally spoke in a low voice that barely sounded like his own. Mom, maybe holding on to all this is just making your grief harder. My chest tightened slightly at the sentence because I recognized immediately whose words those truly were. Vanessa's influence had become so complete that my son no longer separated his thoughts from hers. And sitting there beneath the warm dining room light while the smell of rosemary still lingered in the air, I suddenly understood something Richard must have realized long before I did. They were not waiting for me to heal. They were waiting for me to surrender. After dinner, Vanessa insisted on helping clear the table even though she had barely touched her food. She moved through the kitchen with practiced familiarity, opening cabinets without asking and stacking plates exactly where she believed they belonged. Watching her inside my home felt strangely unsettling now, like observing someone rehearse ownership before the paperwork was finalized. Daniel remained quiet near the sink, rolling up his sleeves while pretending to focus on rinsing wine glasses. The tension between us filled the room more heavily than conversation ever could. You should really consider hiring full-time help around here, Vanessa said lightly while wiping down the marble counters. Large homes become exhausting after a certain age. I folded a dish towel carefully before answering. I have managed this house for nearly 4 decades. Of course, she replied quickly with that same polished smile. But life changes. Sometimes accepting help is healthier than clinging to old routines. Clinging. Another carefully chosen word. Every sentence from Vanessa carried invisible judgment wrapped neatly inside concern. Daniel finally spoke without turning around. Vanessa only means that things do not have to stay exactly the same forever, Mom. I looked at my son standing beneath the warm kitchen lights and wondered when his voice had started sounding so distant inside his own childhood home. There was a time Daniel used to call me every Sunday morning, just to ask how long to roast a turkey, or which laundry detergent removed grass stains from his work shirts. Now every conversation felt negotiated through his wife first. Vanessa dried her hands and glanced toward the hallway leading to Richard's library. Actually, she said casually, Daniel mentioned there are still some business records in Richard's office that probably need organizing before the next hearing. There it was. The real reason for tonight's visit finally stepping into the light. I kept my expression calm. Richard's files are already organized. Well, Vanessa replied smoothly, sometimes older records create confusion during probate. Missing documents can delay settlements for months. Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside the sink. He knew exactly what she was searching for now. They both did. We could help sort through everything tonight, Vanessa offered gently. Take some stress off your shoulders. I met her eyes for several quiet seconds. Beneath her polished composure, I finally noticed it clearly for the first time. Anxiety. Small, carefully hidden, but unmistakable. She was afraid of something she had not found yet. That will not be necessary, I answered softly. The kitchen became very still. Somewhere upstairs the old heating vents clicked softly through the walls. Vanessa crossed her arms lightly, still smiling, though the warmth no longer reached her eyes. Evelyn, she said carefully, with all respect, probate law can become very complicated. If there are undisclosed assets or unfiled paperwork, it could create serious issues later. Undisclosed assets. Interesting phrase. She was circling closer now without realizing how much she was revealing. Daniel finally turned toward me fully, his face tense with exhaustion. Mom, we are only trying to avoid surprises. I almost smiled at that sentence. Because upstairs in Richard's library sat enough surprise to collapse every assumption Vanessa had carefully built over the last 3 months. But instead of arguing, I simply folded the towel neatly across the counter. Your father disliked disorder, I said quietly. He prepared very carefully for important things. Daniel's expression changed slightly then. Just for a moment. A flicker of uncertainty passed across his face before disappearing again beneath caution. Vanessa noticed it too. I could tell immediately by the way her posture stiffened. Prepared for what exactly? She asked. I reached for my teacup calmly. That is something Harold Bennett may discuss at the next hearing. Silence spread instantly through the kitchen. Even Daniel stopped moving. Vanessa's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly at the mention of Richard's attorney. Then she smiled again, though this time the expression looked thinner somehow, stretched tightly across growing concern. And in that quiet kitchen filled with old family photographs and fading warmth, I finally understood something important. Vanessa had spent months believing she controlled the entire game. But the moment I mentioned Harold Bennett, she realized there were still pieces on the board she had never seen. Vanessa and Daniel left just after 9 that evening, though neither of them seemed eager to walk out the door. Vanessa lingered longest near the entryway, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her coat while her eyes drifted repeatedly toward the hallway leading to Richard's library. She smiled when she hugged me goodbye, but the expression felt rehearsed now, almost mechanical. Please try to get some rest, she said softly. Stress can cloud judgment during situations like this. I nodded politely. Thank you for your concern. Daniel hesitated beside the front steps while cold wind swept dead leaves across the driveway. For one brief moment he looked as though he wanted to say something privately, something separate from his wife and the tension that now followed them everywhere like perfume. But Vanessa touched his arm lightly, and whatever thought crossed his mind disappeared immediately. Good night, Mom, he said quietly before climbing into the passenger seat beside her. I stood beneath the porch light watching their SUV disappear down the street until only the red glow of taillights remained against the dark. Then I closed the front door slowly and locked it. The house became silent again almost instantly. Strange how quickly peace returns once certain people leave a room. I carried 2 untouched dessert plates back into the kitchen and began rinsing them carefully beneath warm water. Richard always believed routine helped people think clearly during difficult times. Panic makes mistakes, he used to say. Calmness notices details. By 10:30 I was sitting once again in the library with the black folder open across Richard's desk while a small fire crackled softly in the stone fireplace nearby. Outside, thin snow had begun falling across the backyard, dusting the hedges and empty patio furniture in pale white. Winter was arriving early that year. I adjusted my reading glasses and carefully reviewed the trust documents again, slower this time. Several pages contained handwritten notes from Richard in the margins, small observations most people would probably overlook. Vanessa pushed too aggressively during renovation discussions. Daniel signs documents without reading carefully. Move ownership protections before year-end. Each sentence felt less like legal preparation and more like a husband trying desperately to protect his wife without destroying his son in the process. That realization hurt in ways I could not fully explain. Richard knew Daniel was weak. He simply loved him too much to say it aloud. The phone rang suddenly beside the desk, startling me enough that I nearly dropped my glasses. Harold Bennett's name appeared across the screen. I answered immediately. Harold. Evelyn. His deep voice replied warmly. I assume probate court yesterday was unpleasant. I glanced toward Richard's photograph resting near the bookshelf. That depends how one defines unpleasant. Harold sighed softly. Richard warned me Vanessa would likely push aggressively once formal proceedings began. I was hoping we would have more time before things escalated. I leaned back slowly in the leather chair. She suspects there are documents she has not seen. Good, Harold answered calmly. Let her suspect. Anxiety makes careless people reveal themselves. His confidence steadied something inside me. Harold had known Richard since college. Together they built careers, raised families, and survived enough business negotiations to recognize manipulation quickly. Daniel looked nervous tonight, I admitted quietly. He still does not know about the trust, does he?
No, Harold replied.
Richard instructed me very specifically. The trust remains undisclosed until the second hearing. Legally, everything was structured correctly months ago. Vanessa cannot touch protected assets once the court reviews the amendment. I closed my eyes briefly, absorbing the weight of those words. Vanessa had spent weeks behaving as though victory already belonged to her. Meanwhile, the foundation beneath her entire plan had quietly shifted months earlier without her knowledge. There is one more thing, Harold added carefully. Richard left additional instructions sealed separately. He wanted them opened only if Daniel chose Vanessa over you publicly in court. The fire crackled softly in the silence that followed. Snow continued drifting past the dark library windows while my husband's empty chair sat motionless beside the fireplace. Somewhere deep inside my chest, grief and understanding tangled together painfully. Because even after 43 years of marriage, Richard still knew exactly how this family would break apart long before I did. The second probate hearing took place 3 days later beneath a pale December sky that left downtown Chicago looking cold and colorless. Snow from the previous night still clung to the courthouse steps in thin gray patches, while attorneys hurried through the revolving doors carrying leather briefcases and paper coffee cups. I arrived early with Harold Bennett beside me, both of us moving quietly through the crowded marble lobby while fluorescent lights reflected against polished floors. Harold carried Richard's black folder tucked securely beneath his arm the entire time. He never once loosened his grip on it. "Today we'll move quickly once the judge reviews the amendment," Harold said calmly as we entered the elevator. "Do not react emotionally no matter what Vanessa says." I adjusted the collar of my navy wool coat. I stopped expecting kindness from her weeks ago. Harold gave me a small nod. "Good. That will make this easier." The courtroom felt more crowded than before when we stepped inside. Vanessa was already seated beside Daniel at the front table, elegant as always in another tailored cream-colored suit with her blonde hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck. She looked confident enough to be attending a business luncheon rather than a legal proceeding. Daniel, however, appeared exhausted. His jaw remained tense while dark circles shadowed beneath his eyes. He glanced toward me briefly before immediately looking away again. Shame changes people physically. I could see it happening to my son in real time. Vanessa leaned toward him and whispered something softly. Whatever she said caused him to straighten slightly in his chair like a man trying to remember which side he belonged on. The hearing began promptly at 10 o'clock. The judge reviewed several procedural documents first while attorneys exchanged formal statements regarding estate valuation and corporate holdings. Vanessa's attorney spoke with polished certainty about efficient asset transition and clear succession planning. Listening to strangers discuss Richard's entire life using business terminology made grief feel strangely distant, almost unreal. Then Vanessa herself requested permission to address the court directly. Harold's expression did not change, but I noticed his fingers tighten slightly around his pen. Vanessa stood gracefully before the judge, her voice calm and carefully measured. "Your Honor, my husband and I have done everything possible to support Mrs. Harper through this difficult transition. However, several undocumented claims regarding protected assets continue delaying resolution for all involved parties." She paused briefly before continuing. "My father-in-law intended for his company and estate to remain stable under Daniel's leadership. Unfortunately, emotional confusion has complicated matters unnecessarily." Emotional confusion. The phrase settled coldly across the courtroom. I remained perfectly still beside Harold while Vanessa continued speaking with polished sympathy sharp enough to cut glass. "Mrs. Harper has struggled deeply since Richard's passing. We understand grief affects judgment, especially later in life." Daniel kept staring downward throughout the entire statement. He never interrupted once, never defended me, never even looked uncomfortable enough to stop her. And somehow that silence hurt more than the humiliation itself. The judge adjusted his glasses slowly. "Mrs. Harper," he said carefully, turning toward me, "do you wish to respond?" Before I could answer, Harold stood smoothly beside me. "Actually, Your Honor, we would first like to submit an amended trust agreement executed legally by Richard Harper approximately 8 months before his death." The courtroom became very quiet. Vanessa's posture changed instantly. Not dramatically, just enough for someone paying close attention to notice. Her shoulders stiffened slightly while her hand tightened around the edge of the table. "What amendment?" she asked sharply before catching herself. Harold calmly placed the black folder before the judge. "One that removes the majority of protected assets from probate entirely." Daniel looked up immediately then, confusion flooding across his face. Vanessa turned toward him so quickly her composure finally cracked for the first time since Richard died. "You told me everything had already been disclosed," she whispered harshly beneath her breath. But my son looked genuinely stunned now. Because sitting in that cold courtroom beneath fluorescent lights and legal paperwork, Daniel Harper was finally realizing something devastating. His father had trusted his wife far less than either of them ever imagined. The courtroom remained silent except for the soft rustle of paperwork as the judge opened Richard's amended trust documents one page at a time. Vanessa no longer looked polished and composed now. She sat frozen beside Daniel with one hand gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles had turned pale beneath the courtroom lights. Across from them, Harold Bennett adjusted his glasses calmly, completely unshaken by the tension spreading through the room. He had probably witnessed negotiations collapse before. But for me, watching my husband's final preparations unfold in public felt strangely intimate, almost sacred. The judge reviewed several pages carefully before looking up toward Vanessa's attorney. According to these filings, he said slowly, the majority of Mr. Harper's business assets, investment accounts, and primary residence were transferred into an irrevocable protected trust approximately 8 months prior to death. Vanessa's attorney frowned immediately. Your Honor, we were never provided copies of these amendments during initial disclosure. Harold answered before the judge could speak. Because the assets named within the trust no longer qualified as probate property under Illinois law. Disclosure was not legally required at that stage. The attorney opened his mouth again, then stopped. There was nothing to argue. The documents were valid, properly notarized, properly filed, every signature complete. Richard had anticipated this entire battle long before any of us realized we were entering one. Daniel finally turned toward me then, his expression no longer defensive but deeply confused. Mom, he said quietly, almost under his breath, did you know about this? I looked at my son carefully across the courtroom. He seemed smaller somehow than he had just an hour earlier. Not physically, emotionally, like someone suddenly realizing the ground beneath him had never been stable to begin with. Your father trusted me, I answered softly. Vanessa spun toward Daniel immediately. You said Harold already submitted everything months ago, she whispered sharply. You told me there were no additional protections. Daniel blinked at her in stunned disbelief. I did not know about any of this. How could you not know? She hissed quietly. The judge looked up, briefly at the interruption, forcing Vanessa back into silence. But the damage had already begun. For the first time since Richard died, cracks were finally appearing between them. Harold reached calmly into his briefcase again. There is one additional document the court should review, he said. My chest tightened slightly because I already knew what he was holding. Richard's sealed instructions. The envelope had remained unopened for months inside Harold's possession, waiting for exactly this moment. The judge broke the seal carefully while the courtroom sat motionless around him. Even the court reporter stopped typing briefly. This letter, the judge explained, scanning the first page, contains written guidance from Mr. Harper regarding management intentions for protected family assets. His eyes moved lower across the page, and I watched his expression shift subtly from neutral professionalism to quiet understanding. Then he began reading aloud. If my son allows anyone to diminish or remove Evelyn from the life we built together, I ask the court to understand that such actions were taken against my wishes entirely. My wife sacrificed 43 years helping me build Harper Industrial Supply from a single rented warehouse into a successful company. Everything I leave behind exists because of her loyalty, patience, and strength. Across the courtroom, Daniel lowered his head slowly into his hands. Vanessa stared forward without blinking. The judge continued reading calmly. Daniel is my son and I love him deeply. But he confuses avoidance with peacekeeping, and I fear others may use that weakness after I am gone. Therefore, all protected assets remain solely under Evelyn's authority, unless she chooses otherwise herself. Silence filled the courtroom once the judge finished reading. Not tense silence this time. Heavy silence. The kind that settles over people when truth finally enters a room nobody expected it to reach. Vanessa looked toward me then, but the confidence that once sharpened her expression had disappeared completely. For the first time since Richard died, she understood something irreversible. My husband had seen her clearly from the very beginning. And despite all her planning, all her careful manipulation, all her confidence inside probate court, The final decision had never belonged to her at all.